It is rare indeed when a person has the good fortune to meet a saint. But Eric Liddel came as close to it as anyone I have ever known. A track man, he had won the 440 in the Olympics for England in the 20s, and then had come to China as a missionary. In the camp, he was in his middle 40s, lithe and springy of step, and above all, overflowing with good humor and love of life. But there was much more to him than that.
He wasn't very tall. He was a fairly squat, fairly well proportioned, but he didn't give the appearance at all of a runner. And in fact, on the first occasion, we asked him whether he was still continuing running, and they said, oh, he did just a little. And he said, well, we can't hope to keep up anything like Olympic standards in the conditions in which he was living. But my first impression, yes, was I was amazed that such a person could have been an Olympic runner and could have achieved the prominence that he had achieved.
I guess the name Eric Liddel means to me someone who is uncompromising, not just as an athlete, which he was in Paris in the 24 Olympics, but even more importantly, uncompromising as a man. He competed at the highest level as a member of the track team and as an athlete, but his life beyond the Olympics is more significant to me than anything else, because he was a champion as a man, and what he did for the next number of years in his life until he died took more dedication, took more discipline, took more selflessness than anything that he ever did as an athlete. And that's where, for me, the real challenge is in my own life as I enter that part of my life now that's beyond professional sport.
Liddel was a completely self-contained man.
He was not only full of life, he was, and this is the way I have thought about him, full of light.
To my mind, I think Eric was a special kind of saint.
He was full of sunshine. He was full of joy.
He was absolutely in control of himself. He was happy within his beliefs and within his relationships with everybody around him.
He was a person that immediately you met him, you felt uplifted.
I was never disappointed in anything he did. I approved wholeheartedly, as one does if you've got a hero.
He was full of overflowing love to other people.
That he was the most Christ-like man I've ever met.
He very vividly portrayed a person, as Christians would say, full of grace.
That's what I liked about Eric Liddell's character, and that's what I found in the end, that I could play him without with conviction, because I was sure that the man would never ever do something which I wouldn't like.
The Victorian age was the great age of the heroes. The 20th century was the great age for finding what was wrong with the heroes. I came to look at Eric Liddell looking for the weakness, looking for the Achilles heel. He couldn't possibly be that nice. He couldn't possibly not have a fault. He couldn't possibly be that likeable to everybody.
The biggest danger, I mean, writing about a good man is a terrifying thing, you know. And a completely good man like Liddell, you're in trouble. I mean, I tried desperately to find something wrong with him. You know, I interviewed people and said, did he have any faults? And none of them could think of any faults.
And then the problem to me as a writer was how to represent simple goodness.
And you think, I'm going to make a boring character here.
And I thought, hey, hang it. I'm going to write about this man as I find him, and I'm going to make goodness as interesting as Eric Liddel was himself. I'll just let the man speak.
Eric Liddell's running career began in the Scottish Highlands, but as Eric was so often to say, that wasn't the first time a member of the Liddell family found himself running, because the Scottish Highlands were also the home for Eric's ancestors, and many times in their raids across the Scottish border they found themselves retreating with more than just a walk. Eric Henry Liddell, born January 16, 1902, the second of 4 children to the Reverend and Mrs. James Dunlop Liddell, Christian missionaries. They were kind, caring parents, always sensitive to their children's needs. Remember, Eric came to Scotland as a 5-year-old. He was born in China and, of course, would later return there. But when Eric's parents returned to China as Christian missionaries, he and his brother stayed at a boarding school for Christian missionary children. And it was there that Eric had his first opportunity to become involved in competitive athletics. It was a school whose theme was using sports to turn boys into young men. And maybe because of the absence of Eric's parents, he was forced to channel all of his emotion and all of his energy into sport.
And blow me, what did I find when I went to talk to the people who knew him? But that he was like that. Now that intrigued me. I went to not just his sister, whom you would expect perhaps a rather rosy picture from.
I can't say that I remember him having any weakness unless it was being a bit too modest. You know, he just, he didn't tell you what he was doing. He went to stay with an aunt in Glasgow, and they didn't know what he'd come through for some sports. And it wasn't until they read it in the papers the next day that he'd won the championships. Well, they didn't even know he was running the championships, you see.
Not just from his old colleague, Annie Buchan, who knew him and worked with him and loved him and nursed him in his death.
His whole life was surrendering to God. He was very conscious of his aim to do God's will. In all his sport, which he thoroughly enjoyed, he enjoyed his university, he was an excellent scientist, very meticulous in everything he did. But he had this sort of inward feeling that he was doing it from the highest motives, we'll say.
From these people, you would expect them to say that Eric was wonderful. But I talked to the people who had run with him and who had noticed, well, both the quiet courage of the man in the stand that he took and the way that he quietly lived his faith when he was talking to them and being with them. And they were impressed by that. And everybody spoke of the fact that, no, they couldn't think of anything wrong with Eric Liddell.
I will build my love a cabin, clean and broad across the doorway.
I think for me as a Christian athlete, and I think for most Christian athletes, Eric's story has brought it to the limelight and I think to the public consciousness that you can be highly competitive and still maintain your values. Our challenges today are a lot different as athletes than they were in Eric's day, but the challenge, capital C, is to understand that we're very special in life, not because of what we do, but because of God's love for us.
Chariots of Fire is an interesting movie because it was produced by, quote, secular, unquote, producers.
Whenever it's sunny and everything, I'm an atheist, but in the middle of the night, and I'm on my own, I start getting feelings that there might be something in it all.
We've struggled a long time with how to communicate Christianity through the mass media. It's very difficult to give doctrine or abstract teachings. We perhaps believe that the best way now is what we call the indirect way, to show the outworkings of Christianity in one concrete human personality.
I always felt I was just an instrument. That was the great thing about that character, was because he was so strong. You know, I felt he was so strong. that all I really needed to do was just be there.
It shows a man who is trying to follow through with all of the problems, the implications of being a Christian in the contemporary world.
It was about sport for a start. I'm a sport nut. I mean, I think David Putner realised this, that he had a film about sport. And he thought of me because he knew I was desperately interested in sport.
They discovered a true story, which gave them a basis for this film. After all, this is the way the Bible does, starting with Abraham, Moses, the prophets, ending with Jesus and the apostles.
I was intrigued by a sportsman, an international sportsman, who was concerned enough about his own integrity to jeopardize his sporting achievement. Usually the concept of a sportsman is to do anything to succeed. You know, they'll sacrifice anything. When you interview Olympic sportsmen, that's all their aim in life is to win an Olympic medal. And it was Abraham's only aim in life, was to win an Olympic medal. But Liddel was prepared to sacrifice that one chance that a man has for the sake of his own personal integrity and his own personal belief. That was what interested me.
So we ought to rejoice if people have been sensitive to the needs of our time to produce a film like Chariots of Fire.
Well, it's taken me a long time, you know, to do this. I've been very frustrated for 20 years in film. I've always wanted to work in theatrical film. I've been in commercials for a long time, and documentary, which I love doing, I began, and that I've always loved doing that. And I always used to do it. You know, even when I got into the commercial, I used to do one a year. But commercials were very restricting. Although, I learned a lot from them. But it's been a releasing. Doing this film released me completely. I used to get terrible migraines for 15 years. 3 or 4 a week. And once I started to do this, they went.
But you know the speech in the rain? That speech in the rain where Liddel speaks to the people.
You came to see a race today. See someone win. Happened to be me. But I want you to do more than just watch a race. I want you to take part in it. I want to compare faith to running in a race.
The big problem is this, not ever having read the Bible and not being particularly religious. My upbringing wasn't particularly, so I had to find out what made the guy tick, you know, what this was. It's an integral part of the man. That was him, his religion. So anytime I found anything in the Bible that I could personally could stand up and talk about with conviction, I would mark down or write down. So I had a little book in the end of hundreds of different quotes and sayings from the Bible.
It's hard. It requires concentration of will, energy of soul.
I remember him coming up to me and he said, "How can I preach, Colin? How can I preach like this man preached?" I said, "Well, you've got to preach like a Manchester United football supporter talking about his team. You know, that God and Christ to Liddel were as real as anybody else's passion."
I said, I can't possibly carry on like this. I got in a terrible state because I couldn't be convinced of my own religion, my own beliefs. And he said, "Well, write your own speech." He said, "Choose something else, write, say what you feel like saying."
Because it's very difficult not to make a character like that sanctimonious. And that's the problem. Because, right, you say goody two-shoes, but absolutely, it's, and to become overbearing and shoving a religious message. And the script really, we cut quite a lot out of the script in that, with Ian and myself. We did a lot of trimming and rewriting for him.
So the weeks went by, and every night I would think about it. And I'm no writer, and I would try and write things. And each time I wrote something, it sounded terrible, and I screwed it all up, and I bombed through it, and I got into a right old state about it. And the night before we went to do this, we're doing this shot in the morning. The night before, I just thought, well, I haven't got anything, I thought, well, I haven't I haven't got anything. Tough. So the next morning I turned up on set. We were due to do it in about 2 hours' time, this scene. And I said, Hugh, I'm sorry, I can't do it.
The words were written that obviously worked on paper, but as soon as the actor came in, he had to be able to speak them. And since he was speaking, messages of God, if you like, from his point of view, they could have been very pompous.
So he said, right, took me into his car, locked all the windows, we had a tape recorder, and we sat there, and he said, all right, tell me what you believe in.
It was difficult. That was the most difficult.
So then I told him, well, I think this is good, this is, I like people that have humanity, I like human beings. I just came out with all the things that I thought was good. And we replayed the tape, cut it all together, and put sentences here, and condensed it down to a speech, which I then had to go and do.
So who am I to say believe, have faith, in the face of life's realities? I would like to give you something more permanent, but I can only point the way. I have no formula for winning the race. Everyone runs in her own way, or his own way. Then where does the power come from to see the race to its end? From within.
So I had to write it on a piece of paper, and I had it in my hat. And I sort of kept most of them in my mind. I had it in 2 sheets of paper written in ink in this hat. And of course, when the rain started, at one point halfway through, I thought, well, I don't think I'm going to remember the next bit. And I looked down, and there was just this great blur of ink falling down. And I thought, oh, well, I'll just carry on. So I just kept talking off the top of my head.
Jesus said, behold, the kingdom of God is within you. If with all your hearts you truly seek me, you shall ever surely find me. If you commit yourself to the love of Christ, then that is how you run the straight race.
Well, when I was watching Chariots of Fire, after it finished, the producer, Duchman, said to me, what did I think of the film? And I said, well, it was like Eric telling me all over again. The stories are all there.
I don't think Eric thought about what people thought about him, but I think he felt that through him he might disgrace Christ. It was more to feel that he was putting Christ first, and if he didn't do right, well, he was letting Christ down.
Jenny was close to Eric. I needed somebody who was close to him, concerned about him, and yet involved in his religious life, who would put it to him that he may be jeopardizing that by following his ambition in the athletics sphere. This pressure was undoubtedly put on him, but by his friends in the mission. You see? Now, what do? Invent Jock Smith or Harry Rathbone or somebody to come in and put this pressure on him, and the audience couldn't have cared less about it. But if somebody like Jenny, who is close to him, and they've learned to know and respect, puts the pressure on him, then it means that much more, and he feels obligated and he feels guilty about it. So I put into the mouth of Jenny the sort of pressure that was put on him by his friends in the mission. I went up to Jenny and explained all this to her, and she realised why, and she agreed to it.
But in the film, of course, they rather make us against its running, but no, we're all very pleased.
He was quite unlike most of the people I'd ever met. For start off, he didn't walk his steps, they sort of had a spring in them, and his eyes shone. And he was just an inspiring person to meet, to a 14-year-old, and he was so good. The goodness really shone out of his whole being.
Please, Mr. Liddel, would you sign your name, please?
Surely. Better pick yourself a pen.
Well, I felt other people should be in on this. I didn't want to keep it to myself in any way. So I started this club at school, and we went to all these meetings, as many as we could go to, and we had a membership and rules, things one had and had not to do, and he became our honorary president.
It was Liddel that the women went for in the film, not Abrahams. And that must have been a quality. That's why I had in the film, if you remember, his little flirtation with the little girl who I wanted to show him that he was a man's man, and that he was quite prepared to give a little wink to a pretty little girl and give her his autograph and so on. He was a warm man, you know.
I mean, first of all, I'd just like to say, whenever an actor plays a part, it changes them. It does affect you. I mean, it doesn't change you permanently, but it certainly affects you. You know, for the while that you're playing that part, it brings out areas of your personality. And so, in that sense, to be asked to play a man who has such calm inside him was very good for me, very good indeed as a person, because that rubs off.
It was remarkable how well things went when we had 10 weeks to shoot a totally period film. We created, many miracles happened. We created the whole Olympic Games in one day, really. But just by chance, somehow, we happened to be a holiday, a national holiday. We put ads in the papers, and 12,000 people came, and we were able to do it. I mean, in a way, it's not big enough, the Olympic Games in the film, but it's adequate. And we had to do it in one day because we only had those people. So we had to do all one day to do all the wide shots and to do all the running, all the races. We had one day, and that's a sort of miracle that happened. And we always used to say, "Well, Eric's watching us."
Eric's decision not to run on Sunday was not anything that was long or drawn out. It was something for Eric that was made in an instant. But despite the fact that with the ease with which Eric made that decision, it had some other ramifications, because had Eric just been an average Olympic athlete, it wouldn't have taken on the significance that it did. But Eric was not only the favorite son of Scotland, he was Britain's best hope for a gold medal.
Oh, the pressure would be brought. I capsulated it into one scene where the hierarchy of the British establishment, the Prince, the leading lords, and the president of the Olympic Federation all meet Liddel as a man to try and persuade him to change his mind. It would be far more insidious than that.
I won't run on the Sabbath, and that's final.
Such is the resolution of the young man you have before you, gentlemen.
Don't be impertinent, Liddel.
God made countries. God makes kings, and the rules by which they govern. And those rules say that the Sabbath is his. And I, for one, intend to keep it that way.
And really, I think that's what the attraction of a film is. That's what Eric did. Refused to compromise, refused to be told what to do. In the case, of the Olympic Games, by the committee. It must have been very frightening for that boy. I mean, he was a boy, really, a 22-year-old boy just out of university, just finishing. And to be confronted with those figures, Lord Birkenhead, who was Attorney General, who was the most important legal figure in the land at the time, Prince of Wales, and all those extraordinary characters. I mean, we'll forget we're in 1923, 24, and things are a great deal different than they are today.
Sunday now is a day of sport, isn't it? However, but I think Eric would stick to his guns. If he felt as strongly now as he did then, I'm sure he would stick to his guns.
Yes, indeed. That had been boiling up for some time, because he had made up his mind long before he came to Cologne that he was definitely not going to run on the Sunday, and kept reiterating that statement. However, when he got there, he was lobbied by quite a number of the fellow athletes to say, come on, Eric, you've got to run for Scotland, you've got to run for the country. Change your mind. And I could see that he was under tremendous strain, not to say, oh, all right, I suppose I'd better, but he didn't. He just said, I don't run on Sundays. Finish.
And I know when he refused to run on the Sunday, he was so much criticised. It did affect him, but I always felt that criticism just went over his head, that he took no notice of criticism.
I had the band of the Cameron Highlanders in the stadium. We were all sitting down on the grass, very informal that those games were in those days. And I said to the pipe major, now come on, just before, when they started to get ready, just get up quietly and play the first 8 bars of Scotland the Brave. Eric said afterwards, did you do that to frighten the opponents? Certainly gave me a lift up.
Well, the 440 really has 3 phases. It's almost 3 races. You have the acceleration at the start to get to top speed. You have the maintenance, which is the longest part of the race, about 200 yards, where you're trying to maintain top speed and yet stay loose. Keep your neck loose, keep your arms, maintain your stride so that you're not having to chop it. And then, of course, you have the finish.
And he ran simply because of the thrill. He was riding a plane, a spiritual plane. And he says in the film, when I run, I feel God's pleasure.
When we were at drama college, we used to do exercises called trust exercises. That's exactly what they're called, trust exercises, in which you do things like you have to run across a room, full pelt, with your eyes closed, and your fellow students will make sure you don't crash into anything. They stand at the other end of the room, they catch you at the other end, which it's all to do with trusting your fellow students. You know, that's what all those exercises were about. And it's very hard to do that. And the funny thing, I had exactly the same feeling when I suddenly tried to run like Eric ran. It was exactly the same, and that's exactly what he must have done. It's trust. He just put his head about and he trusted.
Eric's style was different not only from every runner his day, but even the runners today. He not only ran very fast, but he ran with his head back, his arms up, and of course violated almost every principle that we have in track today, and yet he was still successful. He was a man who not only ran his life by faith, but obviously ran on the track by faith too.
So where does the power come from to see the race to its end? From within. Jenny, I believe God made me for a purpose. But He also made me fast. And when I run, I feel His pleasure.
Just simply got it out of his system and went on to China and fulfilled what he regarded as his destiny in becoming a missionary in China. And it proved to be quite a horrendous experience, you know, because the war came and the Japanese occupied the area of China where he was.
Unlike many Olympic athletes who really don't know what they want to do after their competition ends, Eric already had in mind where he wanted to spend most of his life, and that was nearly 10,000 miles away in a Chinese port, a bustling port of 1 million people, Tientsin, China.
Well, I always knew that Eric would go back to China. I mean, from odd times I had spoken to him, and when he'd come to our house for a meal, that it was obvious that China was where he would go back to.
Missionaries of that day were not only involved in the evangelical work with the native Chinese, but also provided many of the social services. In Eric's case in particular, providing science education for a country that in the 1930s was filled with superstition, filled with illiteracy.
It was the end of an era. China had been virtually occupied by European powers for almost a century. The large cities of China along the coast belonged to Britain. They were called treaty ports. China itself was in a confused political situation. There had been a revolution against the Manchu dynasty in 1911 by Sun Yat-sen. Since that time, China had been at civil war. There had been the forces, I hesitate to call them democratic, they were forces representing a much older China, which during the 20s and the 30s had a kind of uneasy warlike situation between themselves. There were also a number of warlords who ruled particular areas of China. It was a feudally confused situation.
During his time in Tientsin, he had a young lady by the name of Florence, 8 years his junior, who in 1934 became his wife. After they were married in 1934, they quickly had 2 children, and not very long after that, Eric felt another call that God was leading him into, and that was to go off alone into northern China.
So the Japanese were seeking to banish the Westerner, the white person, European and American culture from Asia. They were also seeking to establish Japan as the center of that culture. In 1936, they came into China and swept with cruelty and with terror. Through Shanghai, through Nanking, through Peking.
Eric's work as a traveling missionary in northern China really reflected what his father had done years before when Eric was growing up and was left back in Scotland. Eric's father had gone off and left the family, and here again, Eric leaving his own family. So this was nothing new to the Christian missionaries of that day.
We were in the country with uneducated, the Chinese. Eric had been with students. And so it was quite a different thing for him to come and go out in the country. And they harder because that was his first contact with war. And he just said it's hard, the hardest I've ever been. Well, I don't want to go telling them, because we had so many terrible cases come in. But I often said to the Chinese Christians, the Japanese are doing not any worse than your civil war enemies were doing.
Eric came back from that trial in northern China and sent his wife back to Canada, and she at that time was pregnant with what would later become their third daughter, Heather. Eric decided to stay and later was interred in a Japanese internment colony.
I think it's probably true to say that when he sent his wife and 2 children home, he didn't expect to have separated them for very long. This was early in 1941, and there were at that time preparations for more relief boats to be sent to evacuate the British and American populations. Also, there was no certainty that the Japanese were going to come into the war. I think what Eric wanted to do was to get his wife home so that the unborn child could be born without any problems arising. And in fact, just 2 days before Pearl Harbor, before the Japanese declared war, I visited the British consul in Peking, and I was told quite clearly that Japanese won't declare war. Nothing's going to happen.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese.
With the Japanese attack upon Pearl Harbor and upon Hong Kong and upon Singapore and the Philippines, all of which happened at once, we of course became their enemies. And shortly after the war, it was about a year after the war had begun, as I said, in the beginning of 1943, they put us all into an internment camp, and that was where I met Eric Liddel.
By the time he got into internment camp, it was quite obvious it was going to be a lengthy period. Even then, it had stretched to 2 years, and the future looked pretty bleak at that time, because the Japanese had achieved quite a number of victories in the war.
The camp was a mission compound in the middle of Shantung province, a flat farmland in North China. The mission compound was about 150 yards by 200 yards, surrounded by a 6 to 7 foot wall with barbed wire around it now, as the Japanese had it, and with guard towers, machine guns, and so on. Inside of it was the equipment of an American Presbyterian mission. That is, school building, the hospital, a church, little rows of rooms for the students, which were now lived in by the family. The single people lived in the school rooms of the school buildings and the top of the hospital and so on. The people in the camp came from all the cities and areas of North China. 2,000 of us, representing every conceivable level of human life.
Eric's temperament was always so cheerful and so calm. You never saw Eric in a hurry. And yet he was a racer. His talk was slow and distinct, and so was his ways. Everything was well thought out, meticulously done.
It was only in the quieter moments that one would ask about had he had a message from his wife, that the pain would show up in his answers and in his face. That yes, he had had a message, but there's no real information and so on. Or no, he had not had a message. The only messages we got were replies to Red Cross letters, about one a month. That is, if they came through.
I knew him because he was a very obvious member of the camp community. He was that not only because he was such an unusual man, but because every Britisher, when we first came into the camp, would nudge you in the ribs and say, "Do you know who that is over there?" And you would, as an American, say, "No, I don't have any idea." And they'd say, "That's Eric Liddel. He won the Olympics for Great Britain in 1924, and he refused to run on the Olympics on Sunday." And then they would tell us about the story that was so vividly portrayed in the movie.
Eric Liddel is the one person who has most influenced my Christian life.
He was not only a famous athlete, he was a glowing human being.
At that time, had it not been for the influence of Eric Liddel, there is a strong possibility that I would have drifted away from the Christian faith during the pressures of those early days in internment camp.
Eric never said no. If anybody needed him, he was there. And people didn't realize the strain. It was done without thinking.
I owe my present Christian experience to those few months, it seems like months actually, a couple of years or so, that I spent with Eric Liddel at that time. And this was without Eric Liddel probing, without him saying, what about this, what about that? Rather, just very quietly, his outlining what he thought the Christian life should consist of. And as he said it, so quietly, one, as it were, had the feeling that he's speaking directly to me, but it's the Holy Spirit using his words.
I think Eric's attitude about life was much like that of a fisherman's about the ocean. You know, a fisherman never asks the question, why is the ocean there? He takes what each day gives him. When it's calm, when it's stormy, and he makes the best of it. And in Eric's life, the same was true. For him, the Olympic Games were no more important than his work in China. The great diversity of Eric's life, from the glory of his Olympic victory, immediately to the obscurity of the Christian missionary field in China, and then later to the isolation of the Japanese internment camp, really comes together, though, in Eric's life, and that he did have faith, and he did trust in what Scripture says, that all things do work together for good for those that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose.
I just knew that Eric hadn't long to go. And after trying to talk with him a little, I called to those 2 or 3 of the doctors round, and I said, Eric is dying. And Dr. Grice, this thing, came straight across to his bed. Someone had said there, I don't know. I heard someone shouting, that's nonsense. You see, it was so unexpected.
I don't know how much he really suffered, except that we heard that he had such blinding headaches. And first of all, they thought he had had flu, and then they thought it was this breakdown. I'm not sure when they thought it was a tumour, but they did find that out after his death.
Eric was almost unconscious. He just said to me clearly, and yet difficulty in saying, Annie, it's complete surrender. But he went into a coma, which he never came out of. The next morning, he was gone.
Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are counted as the dust on the scales. All the nations are as nothing before him.
So where does the power come from to see the race to its end? From within. All nations before him are as nothing. They are counted to him less than nothing, and vanity. He bringeth the princes to nothing. He maketh the judges of the earth as a vanity. Jenny, I believe God made me for a purpose. But he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. Hast thou not known? Hast thou not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no strength, he increaseth might. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint.
If you commit yourself to the love of Christ, then that is how you run the straight race.